In 1964, James Baldwin penned an essay called Nothing Personal, which addressed a social and spiritual crisis that was spreading across the United States. In that year of 64, the Civil Rights Act had been signed into law, and 3 civil rights activists were murdered by white supremacists. Lyndon Baines Johnson was pursuing a great society at home and a gruesome war in Vietnam. These and other contradictions unleashed a deep fear amongst Americans, which Baldwin sought to address. This terror, he remarked, has something to do with that irreducible gap between the self one takes oneself as being, which is a provisional self, and the undiscoverable self, which always has the power to blow the provisional self to bits. He goes on to observe that this can happen without our realizing it until it finally strikes us, seemingly out of the blue, during the most ordinary functions of life. All at once, he says, that self which a person or collective has created is, in his words, all dirty rags. We become unrecognizable to ourselves and see our pieces all around us. Over the last several years, at least since 2020, we have experienced a series of self-exploding events. Our sense of security, which the nation so jealously guards, was smashed by a pandemic. A dethroned president grievously violated the peaceful transfer of power. Police lynched a man on the street in Minneapolis and tear-gassed justice seekers afterwards. Many constructed selves, many stories of progress or triumph went to rags. We often faltered at starting anew. But Baldwin anticipated our predicament. Out of what raw material, he asks, will one build a self again? The lives of people, he continued, and therefore of nations, depend on how vividly this question lives in the mind. If it does not live, then one is simply condemned to eternal youth, which is a synonym for corruption. For Baldwin, corruption means being unreconciled with one's past, because it is a state of willful ignorance. But self-making, self-renewal, facilitates that reconciliation because history is the source of our raw materials. Baldwin urges introspection, exhorts to creation, and asserts mortal stakes. In a word, he provides an ethic. And like any good ethic, it helps us to interrogate the past. This is imperative because the terror has not left us, nor has our nation's provisional self ceased to regularly disintegrate into rags. It may even be happening quicker than ever before. In fact, it seems at times that there simply isn't a clear nationwide self or identity. And how could there be? What Americanist self, what coherent story of progress could one tell about our recent history? About a regime which claimed to be salvaging democracy, finally reckoning with our bloody history of racism, only to greenlight the genocidal bombing of Palestinians. Or to pivot so quickly from adulating essential workers back to a historic increase in social and economic inequality. To whatever extent any new national self coheres, it doesn't tend to last long. Guns flow out to the empire's allies too readily, the state itself remains too violent, and the evidence gets back to us too quickly. If you've felt like it is heartbreaking and it is spirit exhausting, and if you felt like that, you are not alone. But amidst the fragmentation of the old self, the old patriarchal, white supremacist, triumphalist narrative, there is still real hope. not the old optimism fueled by capitalism's inexorable growth, which is proving a major source of these crises, but rather the potential for liberatory work and joy. By tapping into that, we create new personal and collective selves. Selves that we build out of the legacies of those who toiled to make the world, out of their tales of resistance and their traditions of solidarity with each other. The fact that the national self has become so incoherent, which is to say that the rich, privileged, and powerful are becoming less and less credible as narrators, is really a unique opportunity. Now, this is not a rallying cry to establish some new patriotism. Many have rushed headlong into that cliche, spinning up a self that couldn't even last the news cycle. We're much better served by looking to those who Baldwin called the excluded and those who risked everything for solidarity with them. And I won't presume to tell you who to be next, don't worry. But for a moment, let's imagine together doing things otherwise. What would it be like to have favorite makers of good trouble rather than favorite figures of the empire? To have a culture less like Mount Rushmore and more like a monument to great strikes and boycotts? In my own life in the labor movement, this has meant taking inspiration from those who built the original Congress of Industrial Organizations, or CIO. There is great hope in the example of organizers who built an inclusive, radical institution that brought together Black and white workers long before formal desegregation. We might turn to the Ella Bakers, the sit-in organizers, the brave critics of the First World War, and think of how we could live up to them and make them proud. In our own tradition, we can reflect on the abolitionist Unitarians and think about how they would live in our moment. I'll wager confidently that pride in supporting protests and dissent will weather much more than any warmed-over nationalism. So yes, our times are crisis-packed, as were James Baldwin's. The selves we've created are thrown from one emergency to the next, fraying and breaking down. But raw materials for more robust selves and stories abound, and we have the privilege of looking back on the troublemakers, the rabble-rousers, the fugitives, and asking them to renew us. May it be so, and amen.